I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. This week on the Poetry of Predicament podcast, we have a long overdue conversation with a fellow Deep Adaptation Forum participant and a writer and educator, Eric Garza. Well, he's always been a grounding influence in those deep adaptation conversations. Hoping today we can spend quite a bit of time on his coining of the phrase, the Traumacene, to replace the often used Anthropocene. A tremendous amount of value in that distinction. Look forward to our conversation with Eric Garza. Hey there, welcome back to the Poetry of Predicament podcast. I'm Dean Walker. And here we are in the last month of the longest year of my life, and perhaps for many others, 2020. And this has indeed been a year of extraordinary impacts and stressors on really a global scale. And then for some of us in some small pockets and regions, even more than that. And it's been a year continuing from 2019 to now, been yet another year of engagement with the Deep Adaptation Forum and community. And that has been quite its own kind of challenge, which we'll probably spend some time talking about in a future episode. But I bring it up because our guest today, Eric Garza, is someone I met through the Deep Adaptation Forum. And I was just telling him before we got going here that it seemed like every time I heard him speak up in one of our countless Zoom meetings, that there was something I got to learn from or see something newly from Eric's perspective. And so I really, he got my attention. And then it was a few months ago that he put out one of his fairly frequent, by my estimation, articles in Medium, and was awakening to the Traumacene. And I don't know, Eric, if you coined that term or not, but wow, it really just hit me. And since then, I just thought, I've got to set up an interview. I really want to talk about that. It's so worth pulling on that thread, not just for the many different kind of points that you brought in to be peripheral to that Traumacene term, but it just seems like it almost on a monthly basis, there's another layer that is just as resonant with that term. So I'm anxious to talk with you a little bit about that. Perhaps we can start there. But I should mention that you are a writer and an educator, and a part-time faculty at the University of Vermont. I saw you in a recent podcast episode with the STOA, which I've really had a great amount of pleasure watching them do the series that you were a part of bringing in new voices and really hopefully stir people up. I really am liking that trend that they're doing, and I thought you held your own very, very well there and informed them in a good way and me in a good way. So I should also mention that perhaps we'll get to hear a little bit about the Quillwood Academy, which is sounds like a new creation on your part. So I hope we'll get there at some point in our time together. But it's those things that I've mentioned and a lot more, that I'm really glad that you're here, and appreciate you spending some time and coming to speak with me and us, and welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you would start us out with just uh, where are you now with this notion of the Traumacene? Has it continued to grow like it has for me over here? I can only imagine it must be similar to you. I mean, here we are in this year of COVID and its extraordinary impact on us around the world, but particularly in the USA, where it just seems like we're now, I God, I keep thinking we've hit bottom, but it seems like we've taken it to a new level of delivering trauma on ourselves. Do you have anything to share about that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I could go on for hours about that, but just
Okay.
for the benefit of the folks who are watching or listening to this who have not read the article, you mentioned that it came out a few months ago, but actually I released Awakening to the Traumacene last May, so May of 2019. So that was written before the era of COVID. I'm working on another article essay right now that is more reflective of the COVID era, but that's not out yet.
Mhm.
Um, and I did coin the term, as far as I know, Traumacene. That is of my creation. So it's been kind of fun to watch that meme kind of
Yeah,
percolate out, and where that shows up. And of course, just because it shows up in other places doesn't necessarily mean people got it from me, because people can come up with things like that
sure.
contemporaneously and independently. But I was inspired to coin that term really as a reaction to the word Anthropocene. And of course, Anthropocene is a term that's been tossed around to mean like this is the geologic epoch where human beings are having this huge impact on on Earth as a planet. Exceeding planetary boundaries is how some people put it. And of course, that's true, but it, in some respects, is also misleading, because it's not all people who are contributing to this domination equally. And this is one of the big critiques of the Anthropocene as an idea. There are people of certain lineages who live very highly consumptive lifestyles who are the ones that are creating this massive impact. And then you have probably a much larger number of people whose lifestyles are not particularly consumptive based, and they're not really creating this impact. They just have to deal with the costs. They're the ones whose islands are slowly becoming underwater and whose homelands are being torched by wildfires and that sort of stuff. And reading through those critiques and others of the Anthropocene, another thing occurred to me that we're naming this geological epoch after this impact that certain groups of people are causing. And so we're very hyper focused on this impact, but we're not really, the word Anthropocene really doesn't tell us very much about the cause, the underlying cause of that. And so I got to thinking, what is the cause? And, years of reading and learning and exposing myself to ideas from a lot of people led me to think that really the cause has to do with trauma, and individual people's trauma that causes their nervous systems to be dysregulated and them to make very poor short-term myopic decisions, as well as historical trauma and ancestral trauma that follow certain lines, ancestral lines that lead to these hyperconsumptive behaviors, which are really, and I don't talk about this in the Traumacene article so much, but I'll talk about this more in the upcoming article. A lot of these hyperconsumptive lifestyles that very much are causing the destruction of the world as we experience it are really self-medication. This is what people are doing in an attempt to cover up all kinds of pain and anguish that they've inherited or that they are living through, just to get by on a day-to-day basis. And so it is this trauma that, different facets of this trauma that represents the underlying root cause of all the troubles and travails that we see when we turn on the news. And so maybe we should have this overarching term to talk about an era that is more reflective of the cause. And that's where the term Traumacene came from.
Yeah. I'm curious if I could just pause you for a moment and truly I have a curiosity, because I for years have been tracking the notion of Watiko or Windigo, or some sort of white man's disease, as it's sometimes called, from various tribes in the North American continent, and how they experienced the cruelty and the devastating impact that they would see in the white men that were coming through, and what on earth could cause that. And so they came up with this notion of that it is a disease, a sickness in a whole group of people, whole culture that happened to be taking over their land and doing what they did. And I'm curious if it shows up like a a chicken and the egg kind of a thing, like you're saying about the multi-generational trauma, and how some of the ways that traumatized a person who's traumatized at that level, or generations who are traumatized, can start to act in ways that are negatively impacted by that residual trauma, year after year, generation after generation. I'm curious, does that somehow seem to fit with your mention of Watiko in your original article? Or does Watiko come first or separate? How does that show up?
Well, so Watiko is the kind of legend of the kind of spirit of evil or something like that, is the way that it is often articulated. And to be clear, one, yes, that was an inspiration for me writing the Awakening to the Traumacene article. It's also worth noting that the idea of Watiko did not emerge with the arrival of Europeans in North America. That idea had been present in many Native North American societies for many generations before the Europeans got there. It's something that, based on my readings, did in fact show up among those Native peoples sometimes, and they had ways of recognizing it, and they had ways of dealing with it, treating it, if you will. And a book that I read many years ago that kind of planted the seed for my current thinking on this was Columbus and Other Cannibals by Jack Forbes. Definitely worthy of a read for folks who are into reading. But yeah, he talks about that at length in the book, the Watiko idea. I'm actually drawn more to a different story now. So you were talking about like how my thinking has changed. And yeah, that story is interesting, but a story that I find more interesting today because it's a much closer metaphor for the trauma stuff, or maybe much more explanatory story is, I guess, a somewhat similar Wabanaki story. So I live in Vermont on land that had been occupied by the Western Abenaki people, and it's still occupied by some of them, although in a much lower capacity. And a Wabanaki legend, they had a legend that they called the Cannibal Giant. And the Cannibal Giant had a Wabanaki name, Gwiwok. I'm probably mispronouncing that somewhat. And the story is basically that there's a cannibal giant that sleeps in the forest. And when people begin consuming the land's resources faster than they can regenerate, and when people damage the earth faster than it can heal, then Mother Earth will send forth a call and awaken the cannibal giant. And the cannibal giant, upon hearing this call, will start dancing. And as the cannibal giant dances, it whips human beings' consumptive tendencies into this frenzy where they begin wanting to consume faster and faster. And the faster people consume, the faster the cannibal giant dances. So there's this positive feedback loop between the cannibal giants dancing and people's consumptive patterns, with the end goal of basically people consuming themselves off of the planet, going extinct. And then once the people consume themselves off the planet, the cannibal giant is able to stop dancing and goes back to sleep, and the earth regenerates. And then, according to the Wabanaki story, eventually human beings will be reseeded again on Earth, and they get another chance. And so this story of the cannibal giant had actually been around for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years prior to the arrival of Europeans. And I learned about this story in a book called Sacred Instructions, written by a Penobscot attorney named Sherry Mitchell. And according to her, in stories that are passed down to her in her people, in North America, people had been through that whole cycle of, extinction, being reseeded, growing in their consumptive patterns, and then going into oblivion again. They've been through that cycle 4 times before Europeans came here. So now we are in a global cycle of that, in the escalation phase of our consumptive patterns. And so there's a cannibal giant dancing in the forest somewhere, dancing faster and faster. And I'm drawn to that particular story because it really mirrors the dynamics of trauma. You alluded to this already, and a lot of people do, that the behavioral changes that cause people to make very short-term decisions and very myopic decisions in terms of not thinking about consequences for other people, those kinds of decisions will eventually lead to more trauma on other people and on themselves. And so there becomes this positive feedback loop. And the more traumatized people are, the harder it is for them to make good long-term decisions. Mm-hmm. And that kind of brings us to where we are in the world today, where a lot of us are just struggling to scrape by, and people are prone to making very short-term decisions because we're just desperate. Maybe I'm not desperate, maybe you're not desperate, but there's plenty of people, even in the United States, the wealthiest country in the world, who are plenty desperate. Mm-hmm. And so, just that feedback loop as it plays out is what's creating, this all the greenhouse gas emissions and climate change and consumptive patterns that are, pushing Earth beyond its planetary boundaries on many fronts.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of, is there something that we can do that will quiet and regulate our nervous system so that we can put this cannibal giant back to sleep? Or are we destined to follow the cycle to its conclusion, which is human extinction? And then, the Earth gets to heal for a while.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good place to shift to an earlier conversation that you and I had prior to this one. And you had a lot of focus, as do I, on so what are the skills? What are the capacities? What are the core competencies as a woman that you've recently, well, not maybe not so recently, but interviewed in a prior podcast that you were hosting, Rachel Rice, and talking about collapse core competencies. it seems like it's a fit for, what are the self-regulation and the co-regulation and the resilience skills that we can start to gather, no matter what the trajectory is, if we're headed towards something that might fall short of the average person's definition of collapse, but it's sure not fun. It's demanding on us in a way that none of us ever imagined when we were growing up, thinking that the fabric of our society would always be in place and it would always be a little bit better for the next generation than the last. I'm curious if that conversation has shifted for you, if you're seeing any trends of particularly useful skills, like I'm talking about, co-regulation, self-regulation, we could call them resilience skills, community building skills, and maybe even the deep adaptation version of the conversation. How I'm curious how you hold it, what words you use, and if it's gotten more extreme, or if the gradient has gotten more demanding now that we have things like COVID kind of amping up the pressure in its own way, not to mention the political and the justice issues and the protests of this year. It's really hard to keep track of the number of things influencing our need for ways to reconnect with our own deeper self, with each other, with the earth, and so on. I'm curious if you have anything to say about that.
Oh gosh, I could talk for a long time on that. Yeah, I think, we have this conception of preppers, and maybe your conception of this is different than mine, but my perception of a kind of stereotypical prepper is someone who stockpiles food in their bunker in the woods, and they've got their bug up bag ready to go, and they probably have a lot of guns and ammunition. And I guess I've come to a place where I just don't see that. I mean, it's a very individualistic way and very short-term way of figuring out how to deal with crises, is just to escape, to flee, as if doing that will things will pass, and then you can go back to your house after a while and resume. And my version of collapse, if we want to use that term, and I'm always very cautious about using that term, but my version of collapse is not something where like something bad happens and then all of a sudden like things radically change. Certainly things like that can happen. My understanding of the future is one where we will see bits and pieces of social and political infrastructure institutions kind of fall by the wayside slowly over time. So it's like a gradual erosion of, a lot of these core institutions. And my take on core collapse competencies, and props to Rachel Rice, because I believe it was her that proposed that term, and we used it as a title for that podcast episode, and she has released a couple of videos under that title on her own with various other people. But I think that learning to get, in the United States, we have this very strong, deeply historical and deeply ingrained sense of individuality. And I think that the more willing we are to confront that and to resist that, I think the better off we will be. And so like a big part of what I think of as core collapse competencies is learning how to communicate well with people, including with people that you might really disagree with. Learning to connect across differences, learning to really check in with yourself and develop your own emotional literacy, your learning to develop a deep sense of embodiment, and those are a list of things, but at the very core of all of those, or maybe even as a foundation for all of those, is something that you already mentioned, which is self-regulation.
Mhm.
Learning how to regulate our nervous systems so that people stay within their window of tolerance. And I talk about this in the Traumacene article at modest length. Psychologists would say that we all have this window of tolerance, and if we can keep our levels of stress and anxiety within that window, relatively low, then it allows us to be in what polyvagal theorists would call our social engagement mode, where we understand the consequences of our actions, we can reason through things, we can get along with other people. All of those are necessary. If our stress levels or anxiety levels rise too high so that we leave that window of tolerance, then our nervous system becomes dysregulated and we might go into fight or flight, we might go into our freeze response. But all of those alternatives entail behavior patterns that are not conducive to us engaging with other people very well. We become very short-sighted. We're not able to perceive consequences. Yeah, we go there, it becomes very instinctive, and we're just not going to make good long-term decisions. And so learning how to regulate our nervous systems so that we stay in that window of tolerance, in that social engagement mode, I think is just top in terms of core collapse competencies. Because if we can do that, it puts us in a position to do a lot of other things that are really useful. And if we can't do that, we're kind of screwed. And you mentioned the word co-regulation, and that basically it alludes to the fact that I talked about self-regulation, and of course we have the capacity for that to a degree, but most people very quickly entrain with the nervous systems of people around us. We're social animals, and we just do that. And so co-regulation, that's basically what co-regulation means. If I'm nice and calm, but I happen to be in a friend group of people where everybody else is really stressed and anxious, then chances are, unless I'm extraordinarily skilled, I'm going to become stressed and anxious like everybody else. And so recognizing that we have effects on the nervous systems of other people that we are with, and that other people we are with will have, their nervous systems will have effects on us. So me doing all this great work to regulate my nervous system is fine, but it's not enough. We need groups of people to commit to this work together so that as a group, we can help to support one another in those kinds of practices. So I think that does not address all of the questions you asked, because the questions you asked were voluminous, but it addresses kind of the core of them, I think.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm curious if, it would be hard not to start to form some sort of judgments and maybe even conclusions about human nature out of this year. I certainly am as prone to that as anyone when I look at particularly the USA has been just jaw-droppingly anti-resilient. I have a whole component of one of the online learning series that people can participate in is called Resilience. And I had to rewrite it completely because, I put the thing together in 2019. And as soon as we started doing what America now is known for around our COVID response, I had to completely rewrite like the bottom end of the spectrum that I was trying to describe of just how antithetical to resilience we are acting. And I'm curious if that has you say anything, because Yeah, I'm just curious what your perspective is about how we're doing and what we're doing and how's it showing up.
Yeah. Well, I feel like there are two things happening. On the one hand, um, by virtue of our historical and ancestral experiences, I think a lot of people carry a lot of trauma. And to
Mhm.
be clear, trauma is not an abstract thing. You know, when we talk about passing trauma on from generation to generation, there's actually a physiological change that, you know, we think of trauma as being nervous system overwhelm. So if my nervous system becomes overwhelmed and I don't have agency in that situation and I don't have a way of escaping, then that nervous system overwhelm will result in certain genes in my body's cells being turned on and off by the addition of methyl groups or the removal of methyl groups. And so that nervous system overwhelm creates a change in my body that materializes as changed behaviors. And if I have kids, those changes can be passed on to my kids so they can have those same changes in behavior, even if they never experience that particular nervous system overwhelm themselves. So when I talk about trauma, that's what I'm talking about, kind of that cumulative behavioral changes that are resulting from these nervous system overwhelms. And so I would say most people, if not all people in the United States, have a lot of this that we're not trained to recognize. And it's changing our behavior and it's changing our capacity to react appropriately. And we're not conscious of those limitations that are being put on us. And because this is all epigenetic, it's reversible, which is wonderful, but you have to do the work in order for that to be reversed. If you don't know that this is impacting you, you're probably not going to be doing that work. So that's one thing that's happening. Another thing that's happening is that I think in our dysregulated state, and when I say our, I'm referring generally to people who live in the United States. So I'm not necessarily saying that either you or I are buying into this, or maybe we are in some respects. But another thing that's happening is that in this state of severe nervous system dysregulation that a lot of people are in, many people become very susceptible to charismatic leaders who promise the world. And so, you know, we might think of these as like cult leaders. They might not think of themselves that way, but you behave in with certain ways, and effectively you become a cult leader. You develop a cult following, and then the people who come following you, it's very easy for you to indoctrinate them in particular ways of thinking because they're not in a regulated state. They don't understand consequences. They can't really reason through things anymore. And so, yeah, I mean, it's almost like, and there's a book with this title out there. I listened to an interview of the author of it called The Cult of Trump, basically talking about how, probably without intending to do this at all, you know, Trump is taking on the role of this nationwide cult leader, and a number of people just fall in line because their nervous systems are dysregulated enough that they're very susceptible to that.
Mhm.
So those are the two things that I see happening: is one, very dysregulated nervous systems, and then so much of this cult-like behavior that's leading people to all kinds of bizarre uh, worldviews, understandings of what's going on
Mhm.
that, yeah, it, you know, in many respects rewards antisocial behavior. And so that's what we see.
Yeah.
You know, that taking that hyper individualism to like the next level beyond which I would have ever imagined.
Mhm.
Like when the pandemic started, it's like, yeah, I mean, okay, there's a virus. You know, they say we need to wear masks. Surely everyone will do this. Nope.
Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in my body of work, uh, I use a particular few phrases to kind of sum up what I think the punchline of what you're talking about, like what got us here, what are some ways to get out of this thing in some sort of human way. And basically, the punchline in my book was what got us into this predicament was our disconnection from the primary sources of meaning in a human life. And those, for ease of conversation, I break down into deeper self, others, earth, and soul. And because I found the whole thing on my assertion, just my conclusion personally is that we are in the midst of world-class problems and challenges. But the most important thing is that we are also in a handful of human-caused predicaments. And because that is the foundation of what I'm putting together and where I've landed, is that really the only thing that gets me out of bed in the morning is the notion that there is some way to reconnect, that there is some way even in my old guy remaining lifetime, that there's some amount of reconnection that I can do in some number of those, categories. And sure enough, it's turning out. And what it's taken me to do that is to let go of pictures, collective and individual pictures of what life was supposed to be like. Given our culture and what we were taught, all of us were growing up with the idea that it's going to be better in the next generation, and these social contracts and social structures and so on, cultural structures will all be in place, and it'll keep, we'll have struggles, but it'll keep getting better. So I'm really listening to what you're sharing, what you're saying, through that frame of the best we can do is to choose, kind of self-assign, self-gather our, well, whatever we would call our practices of reconnection. And how about if I just stop there and just see, does that resonate? And does that point you in a direction you'd like to share about?
Well, so if you had asked me that question, does all that resonate 2 years ago, I would have been on board.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm increasingly struggling with the idea of connection as being like the big thing. Because in a very practical sense, like, how does a human being disconnect? I was on a walk with a friend, and she was talking about how horrible it must feel to be disconnected. And it's like, what exactly does that mean in a practical sense? I think, and maybe this has something to do with dysregulated nervous systems, but I think it's becoming very common to try to talk about some of these predicaments and problems that we face in very abstract ways. Like, what does it mean for a human being to be disconnected? Are you like floating out in space? Because your feet are on the ground, you're eating food every day, so you're as connected to nature as human beings have ever been. You're probably engaging with other people. Maybe you said you had a sweetie, so it sounds like you, in the conversations before this, so you're in romantic relationships too. So yeah, I guess I struggle with the connection, disconnection dichotomy, because to me, it feels increasingly abstract. And I guess what I gravitate towards is something that is a lot more physiological. And, I think about nervous systems a lot. And our nervous system is basically designed to keep us safe. This whole system of fight flight responses is evolved as a way to keep not just human beings, but this is something common to many animals, to keep whatever organism that has that nervous system safe. We avoid threats and we go to the next safe place. And I guess one of the ways that I think about our predicaments now is that maybe there was a time in human history, and I think that there was a time in human history when we felt like we had the ability and the freedom to pursue strategies to help us feel safe that allowed us to partner with other people and with the more than human world in order to pursue a mutual sense of safety. And that probably defines most of human existence, most of anatomically modern human existence.
Mm-hmm.
But probably around the end of the last ice age, and my choice of that date is informed by stuff, and we can talk about that if you want to. But around the end of the last ice age, for whatever reason, groups of people in different parts of the world, instead of choosing partnerships with other people and the more than human world in order to build their sense of safety, they decided instead to pursue strategies that entailed them exerting power over other people or power over nature.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the prevalence of these power over strategies that has created the world that we see.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the ways that I think about this is like, what must I do as an individual and what must people do collectively so that we can pursue the sense of safety that we all want and that we're all going to pursue anyway, but we're willing to pursue that sense of safety using strategies that have us partnering with other people and partnering with the more than human world instead of choosing strategies that involve us exerting power over.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe this feeds into your connection, because I would guess that power with strategies probably would fit the bill of your idea of connection,
Mm-hmm.
whereas power over strategies would tend to fit the bill of disconnection.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think that the power with versus power over dichotomy maybe is more, I would say, less abstract and maybe more grounded. At least it feels that way to me. I would love your feedback on all of that if you have any to offer.
I'm guessing that there is a tremendous amount of overlap with what your terms are saying in your way and what my terms are saying in my way. Basically how I lay it out again in like these courses that I do online and in coaching and so on is that the business as usual paradigm, this industrial complex that we've really, it can't be called any more than 200 years old, and more than likely the vast majority of what we're actually talking about is within the 20th century, and then the lion's share of impact of human beings on the planet and each other could be said to be about my age. Roughly 60 years is when we really got it going on. The perverse incentive built into this system, into these structures, have us be that the people who are the most disconnected, by my definition, the folks who are the least connected with their own deeper truth and so on, with other human beings, with earth and with soul, are the people who are most generously rewarded in our system. They're the ones with the power. They're the ones at the top of the corporations and governments and so on, for the vast majority of them. And some smaller version of that is going on at every level below that. If we want to enjoy the goodies, we got to play the game. And playing the game starts with um, clipping, starting to cut quite early our connections with other people, those sensitivities within ourselves that if we were attending to them would not allow us to kill the oceans off, would not allow us to, within, easily within my old guy lifetime, we'll lose the coral reefs of this world, and not to mention basically the functional fisheries of this world. It would just not be possible. And I don't consider that to be abstract at all. The list goes on and on. I spent the first 200 pages of my book, doing the usual parade of dismal statistics and projections and timing of our impact. And so I have a feeling we're overlapped more than it might seem to you, but I hear you and appreciate it. And I think there are important insights using either set of terms and, context. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would, as I already alluded, I think I see everything that you're saying as being true, and I see it as being a symptom of something that is going on that's deeper. So it's not, I wouldn't see any of that as a root cause. And thinking about root causes, I see the origins of the power over paradigm, if you will. Basically, the earliest outward symptom of it that I can discern is the origins of agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
Because I see agriculture as being kind of a foundationally power over approach to food procurement.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, so that's where I see physical evidence of those power over strategies emerging.
Yeah.
And they've kind of accelerated since then, and they've expanded into a lot of other realms beyond just food procurement.
Yep. I'm with you. I does not at all seem like a binary. It seems like you're just pointing further back in the roots of it, and that to me, the most obvious intensification and acceleration of our impact and of these kind of psychoses that we're talking about, this power over thing, has been the 20th century. And primarily the last 40, 50 years, it's just hard to overstate that intensification.
Yeah, and the intensification is certainly real.
Yeah.
I'm going to offer a metaphor, and I'm going to do this with some hesitation because I feel like maybe this is overused in some contexts. But my dad died of cancer a number of years ago, back in 2011, and he was diagnosed 4 years before he died, 4-ish years, and so there were probably symptoms that were visible before he was diagnosed, but no one noticed them, hence the fact that he wasn't diagnosed. But I think of what we're looking at as being like the point where the symptoms are so severe that you can't help but diagnose that there's a problem. But people who study cancer will tell you that the origins of that tumor didn't start the day it was seen. It might have had its initiation 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It might have been present in my dad, when he was in his 30s, without really showing itself much until he got into his early 60s. And so, if we think about, Watiko, if we want to call it that, or nervous system dysregulation, the roots of that go far back. And we're seeing them in their most intense form now, and we've been seeing them, throughout the industrial era, but they don't start there. And so I think it's important for us to speak as though that were true. Speak as though there's nothing inherently bad about the industrial era, because the symptoms that the industrial era represents are symptoms that have a history to them, even if we don't see them quite as much as we do, in the modern industrial era. All the stuff that you mentioned has histories to it, and I think that history needs to be acknowledged. We wouldn't have seen GMOs if someone, 8,000 years ago didn't decide to, burn down forests out in the Middle East and sacrifice all that wildlife in favor of wheat.
Well, Eric, it's true what you guessed, what you predicted as we started this conversation, that we've got way too much to talk about and not nearly enough time in this session to do that. I'm curious if there's anything that you could share that, it's similar to the Stoa conversation. I remember them asking you a similar question, just for the person who it's still kind of new, this idea of self-regulation and co-regulation. It's new to start to see the world as at least struggling, if not in collapse of some form or another. And I'm wondering if you would mind just sharing another round of what you yourself use as practices to keep yourself upright and and connected in the world in your way. Anything you'd like to share in a way of kind of wrapping up our time together, how you keep your heart open in these times? I'm just curious.
Yeah, lots of places I could go with that. I was very lucky in that many years ago, almost 25 years ago at this point, I fell into a Zen practice. And so I have various forms of meditation practice and similar practices that are more focused on embodiment that I can draw from. And I'm finding a lot of those to be useful.
Mm-hmm.
So like sitting meditation, I typically don't do it indoors anymore. I hunt. And so part of my hunting practice is really seated meditation outdoors, waiting for a deer to walk by.
Mm-hmm.
But it can be, hours of just paying gentle attention to everything that's going on around me and smelling the smells and hearing the sounds and, relaxing my gaze. And breathing techniques I found to be very useful. Like, I teach at the University of Vermont. Everything right now is remote. And so earlier today, I hosted the penultimate class for this fall's course. And I start every class meeting with some kind of a meditative practice.
Mm.
And today I did one where I had my students, we did this for about 10 minutes. But basically inhale for a count of 2 and then exhale for a count of 4. So having an exhale that's about twice as long as your inhale tends to help your nervous system kind of settle itself. So we do, maybe 3 minutes of breathing with an inhale of 2 and an exhale of 4, and then a few minutes of breathing with an inhale of 3 and an exhale of 6, and then an inhale of 4 and then an exhale of 8. And as people get more used to that kind of practice, we might go to a 5 and a 10 and maybe a 6 and a 12, as people can kind of adjust their metabolic rates down so that you don't have to breathe as much. But for people who are new to it, 3 and 6 is probably as far as I would go, maybe 4 to 8. So those are a couple practices. And if people are interested in this kind of stuff, so you mentioned at the start that I have Quillwood Academy. And it's an online institution that I founded to basically bring some of the stuff that I teach to broader audiences at a more reasonable price point than if someone were to try to take a course with me at the University of Vermont. And the first course that I'll be offering is going to be called Finding Sanctuary in a Changing World. And the core of that course, we'll talk about some of the same stuff that we talked about in this episode, actually, but the core of it are just a whole suite of different practices, some of which you might call meditation practices, others might not fall in that realm, that I've learned and used to help me regulate my nervous system, and also that you can do with other people so that the two people can kind of help one another with that path, with that task. So yeah, there's a lot of options out there in terms of practices that we can use, and some will work better for certain people than others. And so there's a certain amount of experimentation that's necessary, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the sooner that people dig into that, I think the better off they'll be. And the more people that dig into those practices, the better off we'll all be, because we'll have a lot more people that can respond in a compassionate and reasonable way to all the crazy that is in the world and that is surely coming.
Yeah. Well, Eric, it has been a pleasure connecting with you at the Deep Adaptation Forum and community from time to time, and really even more of a pleasure to read particularly the Traumacene article, which again, I'll put the link to that here in the show notes, and look forward to the one that you were talking about that's soon to arrive, the COVID version. And really looking forward to checking out what you're offering in Quillwood Academy. Yeah, just really appreciating your input, and again, your groundedness. I think it seems like you are something of a grounding influence, obviously in your own community, and then possibly online through the expansion of the community that way. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk today.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.